Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Nick Breul. I'm a senior project manager here at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. This is our second quarter webinar, but we're a little behind in doing our webinars. And so a lot of what I'll be discussing from my data point today will actually cover details up to year to date. So you're going to get more than just the second quarter numbers. Today, we have, as always, with us Rio Nelson from NHTSA. Rio is a traffic safety specialist with the Justice and Enforcement Services Division. And then we are also joined by a reporter from the Times Union. Emilie Munson will be joining us and discussing some of her reporting on police crashes. So I want to welcome everybody. And as I normally do, I'm going to start with Rio. We'll hear a little bit from him, and then I will go into where we are in terms of fatality crashes and some of the things that we're looking at here at the Memorial Fund. And then we'll turn it over to Emilie and hear about her reporting. And we'll make sure there's time for Q&A. I think some folks may have questions for either myself, Rio, or Emilie. So if we could, Rio, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. I don't have any substantial updates at the moment, but I do just want to take a minute to express our deep appreciation on behalf of NHTSA and the hard work and dedication that the entire team at the Memorial Fund continue to pour into the realm of officer safety and recognition of the truly inspiring, are truly inspiring. I also want to remind everyone of the national mobile campaigns are in full swing. These campaigns, Drive Sober or Get Pulled Over, Ride Sober or Get Pulled Over, kick off on August 16th and will continue through September the 2nd. They are key to our efforts to increase the safety across the country through high visibility enforcement, and materials can be shared and downloaded at www.trafficsafetymarketing.gov. So again, thank you, Nick, and the entire team at the Memorial Fund for your ongoing dedication and support. And your work does not go unnoticed, and we are very grateful for the strong partnership and the mission. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Rio. And you mentioned some events coming up. Part of my presentation today, I'm going to quickly show some images that we got from the latest Police Week, which was just in May. So between our last webinar and now, we had Police Week. So I just threw a few images together from that. I'll remind everybody about our traffic safety programs. And then there are some events upcoming in September that some of you may be interested in here at the Memorial in the museum. But I believe there's also a national event that we call Police Weekend. This is something that came out of COVID when we weren't able to do some of the things that we normally did during COVID. And we kind of bifurcated some of our things like our awards ceremony and things like that. You'll notice immediately the title headed in the wrong direction. That should pretty much tell everyone what you need to know with regard to the numbers in terms of fatality crashes here in 2024. So this, again, a reminder, we are also support the Safe Leo program, which is suicide awareness for law enforcement officers. If you have not or are not familiar with Destination Zero, this is a National Officer Safety and Wellness Award program. We are now honoring the 2024 winners for the National Officer Safety and Wellness Awards. And I'm going to touch on that in a second. But Destination Zero, or DZ as we call it, if you go to our website, lawmemorial.org or NLEOMF as in Frank.org, you can, under our Officer Safety and Wellness tab, find information on Destination Zero. And there's just, I've said it before, if you've been watching these webinars, there's a host of information. We're getting ready to add more. We have videos created for each one of our winners that explains their programs, so it's easily digestible, and then you can follow up with us or those agencies if you have a question. The winner for the traffic side of the Destination Zero Awards this year was Independence, Ohio. Their police agency won in that category, which we refer to as Officer Traffic Safety. And this is largely agencies that are really focusing on improving safety for their officers, but it can also have components for how they have conducted enforcement in a safer manner or been successful with some types of enforcement or reducing crashes, not only on their agency, but within their community. So here are those images I mentioned. This is during Police Week. This is what it typically looks like if you're not familiar with it and haven't been here. During that week, you get lots of survivors and families who come to the wall and leave mementos and take etchings of names, Some of our photos are rather poignant. I just wanted to share them with you so you get an idea as to what happens here during Police Week. As the survivors come for the candlelight vigil, they are escorted off of the bus and they walk past a long full cordon of honor guard officers as they're escorted to their seats so they can sit down on the National Mall and listen to the speakers, hear their loved one's name read, and then participate in the ceremony as we light the candle and spread the light, if you will. And if you look behind that image, you see the Washington Monument and the Smithsonian sitting back there. And then I just chose this photo. I thought it was a particularly good image showing what it looks like. And there's a reason we wait until we don't really start the ceremony until 8:30. And of course, in May, it's still not even quite dark then. But by the time we get through that ceremony, it's dark. And the candles as they're lit is really quite a spectacular sight. Okay, so let's get in and talk about where we are in 2024 with fatal law enforcement crashes and struck-bys. This is updated from our website. It was taken, the last update we did was August 6th. So we're here at August 22nd. So there's more data that needs to be added. It'll be added at the beginning of next month. And I can already tell you that the firearms related cases are up. If you track this, there's been a number of officers in the last 2 weeks shot and killed. Our traffic related numbers were 29 and now we're up to 32. And I just show these numbers because I didn't want to confuse anybody who was looking at our website and seeing different numbers. So we're going to update them again fairly shortly here. So keeping in mind, I have second quarter numbers, but we're just going to take it out through year to date where we are, which gives us 32 preliminary fatal crashes. And if you're familiar with our categories, we have automobile crashes. And a subcategory of that are the single vehicle crashes, because that's one of the things we try to focus on. Those are preventable. I mean, a lot of the things we do here are preventable, but those are certainly preventable. As in the story of most of those crashes, speed, failure to control the vehicle with the introduction of a curve or some other thing leads to a vehicle crash. That means that vehicle went off the road and impacted a tree or an abutment, did not impact with another vehicle. Struck by crashes, there are 11 of those. We focus quite heavily on those. I'll talk about those. And then we've had 2 fatal motorcycle crashes. So as you know, we always like to let folks know what things are happening in terms of agency type, because a lot of folks, sheriffs, are interested in what's happening with sheriffs. And this year is a little interesting because when we started this year in the first quarter, and again, you may have remembered what I said, it was all sheriffs and state. And normally municipal agencies, which are our larger city agencies that have more cars, more people, denser populations, all those things that could contribute to larger numbers of crashes. Municipal agencies usually had led the way, but as we started 2024, it was sheriffs and state. And now you see, as we are where we are now, the municipal numbers have gone up to 11. Sheriffs are 10, state agencies, which are not just troopers, that's everything from conservation officers to state inspection officers, is 9. We've had 1 federal officer killed and 1 territorial officer killed. So as we look at the crashes, you know, I will always give a preliminary look at what it appears the officers were doing at the time of the crash. What activities were they engaged in? And you say 3 were involved in pursuits, 2 were transporting arrestees. I'll talk a little bit more about those cases in a minute. 4 were on either admin runs or going to and from work in their take-home police vehicles. 2 were parked on the shoulder when they were struck. 4 were responding to calls for service. All of those were priorities. 1 was killed on a traffic stop. 1 was on patrol. 1 was conducting an investigation. And then 1 was parked at a crash scene. And I don't want you to get those confused with struck-bys. These are all people in vehicles who were involved in a crash. So we've gotten a lot of data that we've now put out. This is a 12-year comparison. And in 2023, we had a total of 22 fatal vehicle crashes. And that number includes single vehicle crashes. And we're not even through the third quarter now, and we have 19 fatal crashes already. So as I said in the title, we're headed in the wrong direction. 2023 was the lowest year in those 12 years in terms of the numbers of fatal law enforcement crashes. So the types of crash, this is something in the last few years I've been looking at just so people get an idea. And what started me talking about this was we seem to be having a huge number of head-on crashes, particularly right after the pandemic. And that got me sort of curious as to how many crashes are at intersections, how many are head-on, how many were, as you see here. So 3 were at an intersection, 4 were head-on crashes, 5 were the lost control, 4 of which are the single vehicle crashes I mentioned already. 4 were officers who were rear-ended in that type of crash. 1 of the crashes involved a police vehicle rear-ending another vehicle. 1 involved a police vehicle into the river. Both of those 2 that I just mentioned involved the transport of arrestees. Very unfortunate circumstances. The arrestee, in the case where the vehicle, I think the driver was a new deputy, was confused and on the wrong road, and he ended up driving off a boat ramp, and he and the arrestee sadly drowned in that circumstance. And then the other one, I'm looking for more details on it, but it was a response to a call out, but it was in heavy fog. So weather certainly was a contributing factor to that crash, and that's something that I track as I track these crashes across the years. So into the struck by categories, and we've talked about tire deflation devices, stop sticks, spike strips, whatever you want to call them. And that's something that we're still looking at. You see, we already have 1 fatality related to the deployment of a tire deflation device. 1 individual was struck when they were attempting an arrest. And this is a sad situation because it was another police officer who struck that officer. It was part of a multi-jurisdictional, multi-state chase. And as the chase came to an end, officers were getting out of their cars and other officers were still coming in behind them. And there was an unfortunate set of circumstances where an officer was struck and killed. 2 were on crash scenes when they were struck. This is one of the major components of struck by crashes. Officers already on the scene of a crash with all the lights and all that going on, and they still, people are coming through those crash scenes and hitting people. 5 were on traffic stops. That's one of our next biggest categories, and I can't emphasize enough, people are probably tired of hearing about it. Right side approach, right side approach. A couple of these were traffic stops that were driver's side approach. And again, that very well may have contributed to the crash, to the vulnerability of that officer. So we always, if possible, want you to make a right side approach. And then 2 were directing or diverting traffic. One of these struck bys is a community service officer, and I've explained before our criteria here at the Memorial Fund. So I count that crash. It's a law enforcement crash. We're waiting to see where that community service officer is in terms of their arrest powers. Are they sworn? All that kind of thing, which would match our criteria for inclusion on the memorial wall. So we look at a 5-year look at struck by crashes, and last year, again, we were very low comparatively for struck by crashes. And if you've listened to this presentation before or listened to my end of year presentation, one of those 10 that we counted as a struck by was a very unusual circumstance. The number really is almost 9 struck bys. And the sad news is, again, we're not even 3/4 of the way through the year, and we already have 11. So we're already surpassed where we were last year, and so we are moving in the wrong direction. If you're familiar with Responder Safety or the Emergency Responder Safety Institute, I go in once a month and pull their numbers, and they track struck by crashes nationally. And you see they're recording 13 LEOs, law enforcement officers. 2 of those are school crossing guards. That's something that I don't, they're tied to law enforcement, but that's something that I wouldn't count. 7 are towing and recovery. Normally towing and recovery is bearing the brunt of a lot of these roadside incursions where people are struck. 2 EMS fire, 2 DOT, and 1 roadside service technician. So Emergency Responder Safety Institute tracks all of that and updates it regularly, and you can go to their website and get that information. So the 2 motorcycle crashes, 1 officer was on an escort, and we've spoken about this before. That's one of the other bigger circumstances for motorcycle crashes. We have several each year who are either escorting a VIP, escorting a parade or a funeral. In one year, it was very sad. The officer was escorting wreaths, memorial wreaths, to a ceremony when he was involved in a motor crash. So it's something, if you have motors in your agencies or LELs for agencies that have motors, they really need to be careful when they're handling these escorts. We've had that happen multiple times each year. And then one officer was hit by an oncoming vehicle that was passing, two-lane road, car passing another car in the oncoming lane, and struck the officer. As we go through, the year, I end up scrubbing this information, and so by February, I have all the information I need, and will have gone through every single case, reviewed the reports, reviewed the autopsies, the crash reports, the investigative reports, even looking at the CAD data, and we'll have a much better sense of what was going on and what happened in some of these fatal circumstances. As you know, NHTSA, as Rio mentioned, they support us, and we make sure we support them with the data that they need. And Region 4 is the leading region right now for law enforcement traffic-related deaths. It is normally Region 6, and unfortunately, those two Sunbelt groupings there vie for one and two each year. They're densely populated areas, also, of course, also large areas of the United States. Unfortunately for Georgia this year, we have 4 fatal law enforcement crashes in that state. So we always want to look at injuries as well. That's sort of the statistic that I can't get my arms around because it's huge. But I try. In the last few years, I've been trying, and what I've been doing is going through with my own search engines, my own broken out design searches through Google, but also hitting websites and doing just general searches every day to try and get my arms around how many injury crashes there are with law enforcement officers, and or just crashes. And the one thing I would tell you, and this may tie in with what Emilie's going to tell you, is there have, since I've been doing it, where I am right now is twice the number of cases I found reported in 2023 already. For the entire year, I've already doubled that number almost. So it tells me that there's a problem. It tells me that the crashes with law enforcement are up. I think there may be, I think as I refine my search process, maybe I am finding more of these cases, so my numbers are higher. But definitely there is an increase from what I saw in 2023. And that's something that we're trying to pay attention to as well. I also, and you've seen part of this slide before, but I updated it with 2 more down at the bottom. We've been seeing an increase, and this is through my experience, having done this for 10 years and looking at reports every day, an increase in police vehicles being stolen by suspects. And we're concerned with this because it leads to a pursuit. I don't know of any agency that's going to let someone steal a police car and not have everybody chase after it to make sure they bring that pursuit to an end and bring that person into custody. And there are very good reasons for that, particularly to say nothing of the fact that there are weapons in those cars, that, a person in a marked police car could wreak havoc. There's equipment, there's ballistic equipment in cars, there's communication equipment in cars. So it's just something that I think if we can avoid, it'll reduce the likelihood of us having to chase somebody in one of our patrol cars. To say nothing of the fact that it looks bad. But there was one recently in California that was a traffic stop, ended up being a shooting. As they're moving around the cars, the guy gets into the running cruiser and takes off in it. And then if you didn't see this, most recently, an officer is sitting in a Connecticut police car, and it's not the driver, and some guy walks up, starts talking to him, jumps in the car, and drives off with an officer seated next to him. That's probably more about situational awareness, only because no one would really expect anybody to do that in that circumstance, because there was no prior contact with that individual. Of course, that led to a pursuit as well as a crash with their officer in it. Their officer was not injured, as far as I'm aware. But again, another bizarre situation. It seems like the police are more and more chasing people, not only in stolen police cars, but here in DC, we've had 2 ambulances stolen. And if you saw that, it made national news of the MVA road services truck that was stolen. That guy rammed, I don't know how many people, rammed police cars, and was just running amok using that heavy equipment to cause damage. So our key topics really haven't changed. The one thing I want to add is speed. I'm hoping that we're going to be doing a little more work with an organization, which you may have all heard of, called Below 100. And Below 100 has 5 tenets. That is, complacency kills, meaning if you're resting on your laurels and think you've handled it before and done this before and getting complacent about it, that's going to put you in a bad spot. Wear your seatbelt. This is one of the #1 concerns we have and continue to have, as the data shows that 47 to 48% of officers killed in vehicle crashes were not wearing their seatbelt. Wear your body armor. It can protect you not only ballistically, but protect you from crush injuries and crashes. Remember what's important now. That basically means just, put your mind in the game. Remember what you're doing. Take a breath and concentrate on what's going on. And then watch your speed. So speed is a critical element to so many of these crashes, particularly the single vehicle crashes. We've seen success with some speed monitoring efforts through agencies, making sure their deputies or officers or troopers are not going over a certain speed unless there is a justifiable reason. And in many cases there are, in other cases, maybe not so much, but it's definitely contributing to some horrific crashes. So that is my information. And you can reach out and talk to me, send me an email. Normally we mention the flash drives. We are in the process of not only, as you know, each year we do a video story, and that video story is usually about an officer who survived a crash and got back to work, and you hear from them about what they did, and you hear from them about what they might have done differently, or what they might have liked to have had an opportunity to do differently. This year, we're putting together a recommendations and solutions video that's going to cover the most important parts of the data, largely what I just covered in my last slide there. And we will have that added onto our flash drives that will be available at IACP in October in Boston. So the whole officer safety and wellness team here from the Memorial Fund will be in Boston. We will have those flash drives updated with not only the Robbinsville, New Jersey video that we made last year, but a new video we're working on now, as well as some infographics that you can download and post. And I think we're also going to include that presentation, if you recall, from Captain Simbal from Chesterfield, Virginia, who was last year's Destination Zero winner for officer traffic safety. So hopefully we'll have all that on those flash drives. All right, and now there will be Q&A. So please, if you have questions for my presentation or for Emilie's, put those into the chat and we'll work through them when we're done hearing from Emilie. I'd like to introduce Emilie Munson, who is a data reporter for the Times Union newspaper. She previously covered federal politics in Washington, D.C. for the Times Union and Hearst, Connecticut media. Emilie has also worked as a state capitol reporter for Hearst, Connecticut media, as an education reporter for the Greenwich Times, and her investigative reporting has won some state and national awards. Welcome, Emilie.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate that presentation. And thank you to the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund for having me today. Thank you to NHTSA, and thank you to all the law enforcement on the call. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to share a presentation with you about our reporting into the subjects of police-involved car crashes, as well as police pursuits. We spent many months investigating both of these and published a number of stories on these topics in early 2024. So I'm going to go over with you our findings and walk you through them. While our data is mostly specific to New York, the issues that we identified exist nationwide. And I will note that a lot of our data goes through 2022 or 2023, so I'm not going to be able to speak to what's happening this year like Nick did. And I'll be more than happy to take your questions when it's time for that. So after a serious police-involved collision in our area of New York, our investigative team started looking into the frequency of police-involved car crashes. We started this work by obtaining 10 years of statewide crash data from the New York Department of Transportation. That data comes from MV 104 crash reports, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Those are completed for collisions with at least $1,000 worth of property damage, injury, or death in our state of New York. So the most minor damage-free collisions are not included in the data. But this statewide data shows us that in New York, police-involved crashes increased 84% from 2012 to 2019. Then we had a slight drop during the pandemic, and that since then the numbers have been rebounding. And the growth in collisions among police is much greater than the acceleration in collisions among civilian drivers. And we were really interested in why are police uniquely experiencing such a significant increase in crashes. Another way that we looked into this issue was using death data. Our research shows us that as police collisions have increased in New York, so too have deaths. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration found that fatal police car crashes increased 30% over the last 12 years. However, we did find that NHTSA data is a bit incomplete. Sorry, Rio. And we found additional fatal police car crashes in the state of New York data, as well as in news stories that were missing from this federal data. So we compiled our own database that was the results of a number of sources, and we thoroughly vetted each of the fatalities that we included in that database. We spoke to Hope Teasman, a research epidemiologist at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. She told us how officers are actually at a higher risk traveling to the scene of a crash than at a crime scene itself. And underscoring this fact, as Nick mentioned in his presentation, motor vehicle collisions are a second leading cause of death for on-duty officers in the US. More police die from car crashes than almost any other cause except gun violence. We looked at who is being killed in fatal police-involved collisions. Most commonly, it's civilians, other drivers on the road, pedestrians, cyclists. Anthony Stinson, whose picture is on the left, was 13 years old, and he was biking home when he was struck by a police car that had lights and sirens activated and was going to an emergency call. On the right, you see 25-year-old Michael Williams, who was an NYPD officer. He had been on the force for 9 months and was riding in a van driven by another officer. When there was a collision, he was ejected from the vehicle and he was not wearing his seatbelt. As Nick mentioned, about 47% of officers killed in police car crashes from 2017 to 2021 were not wearing seatbelts. And we also found when we looked at the fatalities in New York that a notable portion of police officers killed died in single vehicle crashes. The third data source that we used to investigate this issue was records that we obtained directly from the police departments. And we requested these records because we wanted to make sure that we were having a chance to look at more minor collisions as well. As I mentioned to you before, the state level data would not include a collision if there was no damage. So I'm just going to briefly summarize some of this. We had to request these records directly from police departments using public records requests. So this crash data is not, reported publicly by police departments or shared with any centralized entity. You can see the data that we received summarized in this chart. So what you're seeing in the chart is the rate of police car crashes per 100 full-time officers at these departments. So for example, the Syracuse Police Department had a crash rate of more than 1 crash per 5 full-time officers in 2022. Different departments had, different patterns in their crash rates over time. You can see that a few of these departments did experience that recent uptick like we saw in the state data, and then, some other departments did not see that uptick. But I want to emphasize to you how difficult it was to get really thorough data to dive into this problem. For example, more than a year after we requested crash data from police departments, we are still waiting for many police departments to provide their records to us. One department wanted to charge us more than $1,000 in records fees to access data on their crashes. And I emphasize this because it's a barrier to researchers and journalists and the law enforcement industry to study crash trends in depth if that data cannot be accessed. So it was a major challenge for us to get detailed data in order to study this issue. And I'll also emphasize that there has been relatively little government or academic research into this subject. The national data on fatalities that exists is incomplete to a certain extent. And so generally we have this information gap that blocks a more rigorous analysis of the problem. All that said, we tried to look into the reasons why police car crashes were increasing, and the exact reasons are unclear because of some of the holes in this data and the general lack of research in the topic. But I'll share with you what our own research suggests. So the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health says the most common reasons for police car crashes are speeding, fatigue, stress, and distraction. Many of the crashes police are involved in could have been prevented by the officer, according to our analysis of crash data from multiple departments. Officers get very little driver training throughout their careers often. Many get no refresher trainings over the course of their career, so certain skills could get rusty. And officers may be getting into more collisions recently due to distractions like increasing technology in their vehicles, as well as more rookie officers joining police forces and getting on the road, as many departments have been experiencing retirements and are now filling those positions. So let's talk about some solutions. I'm very briefly going to talk about the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and tell you a bit about their story. In 2009, 3 Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officers died in car crashes. The department had 536 police car crashes that year, and that resulted in 84 injuries. So after experiencing this, the department's leaders decided it was time for a change. They launched a program to reduce collisions through new policies, training, and awareness campaign. They capped officers' speeds and they mandated regular emergency driving practice. And then they brought in a team of researchers to study what happened. And what they found was that crashes decreased, injuries from collisions dropped markedly, and the agency saved an estimated $1.1 million in the 2 years after the program began. Now, in the intervening 15 years, Las Vegas has continued its safety efforts. The department has grown in size, but the rate of collisions per sworn officer remains below where it was in 2009. And when we did our research, we found that very few police departments had taken these dedicated steps, like Las Vegas had, to reduce crashes. And almost no one had, brought in government researchers to study their program in the same way. But there's other examples of departments that have had success with reducing their crashes. We did speak with Chesterfield County Police in Virginia, and they shared with us some of their data indicating their success, particularly reducing crashes that were the fault of their officers. And they've been able to cut those by taking a number of steps. So have these departments do it. As I said, they require regular driving training for all officers. They cap the speeds that their officers can drive at. They set rules around texting. They add backup cameras to cars. They promote driver safety messaging in presentations to officers, on signage in their departments and in vehicles, in statements at shift changes. And they hold their officers accountable for following their policies. Sometimes Chesterfield uses a panel review of crashes, and there's also speed audits as well. So I'm going to shift gears now a little bit here and talk more about pursuits. You may wonder why I didn't talk about pursuits in relation to police-involved car crashes. And that's because the crash data that we saw in New York showed us that police were pretty rarely crashing their cars during pursuits. If there was a collision during a pursuit, it was far more likely to be the pursuit vehicle that crashed. Nevertheless, pursuits are, of course, still an important road safety topic for law enforcement. So we just looked at this in a separate project. And we requested pursuit data from numerous police departments across the state of New York. We found pursuits by the state police in New York had doubled since 2018. Chases by the Westchester County Police Department, which is another large department in the state, had quadrupled in recent years. And many other large police departments were also recording recent spikes that were just unparalleled in the past 5 to 10 years. Now, in the absence of national data on police pursuits, it's hard to determine how widespread or limited this trend might be in other places around the country. But we did attempt to research that a bit. So in California, state and local police departments do report their pursuits to the California Highway Patrol. And data collected by the California Highway Patrol shows departments in California had a similar spike in chases starting in 2020, just like these other New York departments. The Chicago Police Department tightened its pursuit policy in 2020 to bar pursuits for traffic offenses and stolen vehicles. But nevertheless, they still saw pursuits increase from 2020 to 2023. The city of Houston also had chases by city police go up 47% from 2018 to 2022. Chesterfield County, Virginia had a nearly 200% increase in pursuits from 2018 to 2022 with no change in their chase criteria. Similar to what we did with police car crashes, we built our own database of deaths associated with police pursuits in New York using a compilation of federal and state data, court records, and news reports. We found as pursuits have spiked in New York, so too did deaths. And then we analyzed the pursuit policies of dozens of departments across the state of New York. We had to request these policies through public records requests because they're most often not posted publicly and they're not shared with any centralized agency. So we obtained a few dozen policies, but we obtained most of the policies for the largest departments across the state of New York. So the policies we obtain apply to about 76% of sworn full-time officers working across the state. Most of those policies are discretionary, allowing officers to evaluate when to chase. These departments tend to allow pursuits for a wider range of offenses, including traffic violations, and property crimes, depending on the circumstance. Relatively few departments limited pursuits only to violent crime suspects. And a couple of national police organizations have studied this issue in the past. The IACP, when they looked at it, did not issue a recommended policy on when to pursue. PERF, when they studied the issue more recently, recommended limiting chases to violent offenders only, and those that have a risk of further danger if they are not pursued immediately. All right. And again, like with the collisions, we tried to examine what would be the factors driving pursuits up recently. In speaking with police, they told us that drivers are increasingly failing to stop when pulled over by an officer. The Westchester County Police Department reported nearly 5 times the number of motorists fleeing traffic stops in 2023 compared to 2019. Also, more drivers seem to have been committing traffic offenses since the pandemic, and many departments will pursue for a traffic offense. So, for example, 3/4 of the cars pursued by the New York State Police in recent years were traffic law violators. Some cities have been experiencing an increase in stolen vehicles. That's in some places driven by social media fads. And, for agencies that pursue for property crimes like stolen vehicles, they would see an uptick in pursuits in that case. So, for example, in Syracuse, they've had a particular issue with this. And police in recent years have initiated more pursuits to chase stolen cars than any other reason. And then the last reason is that a couple of agencies have really improved their record keeping around pursuits. So we're seeing that reflected in the data. The New York State Police got body cameras in 2021. And, when you speak to officers about this, they'll tell you that, now every chase is recorded on the body camera, so officers might be more likely to complete all the paperwork on these events than they would have been previously. The Buffalo Police Department shifted their record keeping from paper to electronic record keeping, and now that's coincided with an increased reporting of pursuits. So after we published these stories in the first half of 2024, our reporting resulted in the introduction of new legislation in New York on driver training for police. The bill would increase the required hours of driver training in the police officer basic course from 21 to 40 hours in New York. And it would also require periodic refresher training for officers. We also heard widespread calls for better data collection around these issues, and we generally got a lot of feedback from people, including folks in law enforcement, that they were unaware of the extent of some of these issues. So on that note, I hope this presentation has been informative for you. I'm more than happy to take your questions in the Q&A, and also please feel free to email me as well. We will be sharing links to some of my reporting following the call if you'd like to read some of that yourself. And then, of course, you can email me, and I'm happy to share that with you as well. Thank you so much.
What I was going to ask Emilie and anybody in the group, I know there was one case that occurred in New York at an intersection, and an officer was responding to a call at a high rate of speed, but with just their lights on. And then there have been other instances where we've seen, and I can't remember where I was reading recently, officers responding. It might have been a case out of Syracuse with no, not even their lights and sirens on. And, they're in the rush to get to that call, and they run a stop sign, but they're not using any of their emergency equipment. I was wondering if you saw that if you got any details about that, or saw that as a trend, because I know when I was a policeman if I was nearby the call, of course, I didn't want to activate my emergency equipment because I don't, you don't want to let the bad guys know that you're just a hop, skip, and a jump away. But on the other side, if you're, flying and even though it's the middle of the night or early in the morning, you've got to have your lights, at least your lights on and sirens, sounding your sirens as you slow for an intersection. And that seems to be a problem now, because as we're looking at crashes, and that's why I mentioned the types of crashes I look at, I'm seeing more and more where officers are not slowing to clear intersections. But anyway, I wanted to know if you came up with any other data with regard to officers getting involved in crashes and not using their audible and visual signals.
Thank you for bringing this up. It's definitely an important issue. So we don't have data on that, and that's because the departments that we looked at often didn't track that in their data. They didn't track whether lights and sirens were being used prior to the collision. However, we have read crash reports and heard about cases where that involved officers driving to an emergency and either not activating both the lights and sirens, or not activating the sirens and just proceeding with the lights. I spoke to one person who was a civilian driver who was involved in a police collision, who described how he was proceeding towards a green light, and the officer was coming up to the intersection and only had his lights on. And the building next to this intersection was a college campus building, and they were projecting colorful lights on the building. And so the driver who's driving up to this intersection had no visual awareness of the approaching officer, because there was other lights in the environment, basically, of similar colors. And so the officer proceeded through their red light and struck the driver who had the green light when they just had their lights on. And so that's an example of how that could be problematic. And I've definitely heard of departments trying to really address this with their officers and emphasize those policies that even with lights and sirens on, it's important to slow at each intersection and visually clear the intersection before proceeding, because lights and sirens may not be enough to prevent a crash.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And that was something I did notice in a couple of your reports. We do have a question about, you mentioned speed limits for officers. And the question is that on normal patrol or just restricting speed for pursuits?
Yeah, I can definitely give you more detail about that. So both the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and Chesterfield County Police have a version of this policy. I can tell you which each one does. So the Las Vegas policy states officers, even when they have their lights and sirens activated, may not drive more than 20 miles per hour over the speed limit unless they're engaged in pursuit. Chesterfield caps speed during, quote, non-life-threatening, non-emergency events. So in those non-life-threatening events, in zones where the speed limit is over 25 miles per hour, then the officer's top speed is set at 20 miles per hour over that limit. And then in slower speed zones, the officer can drive no more than 10 miles per hour over the limit.
Well, that jives exactly with what I had when I was on my agency, in response to what we call the Code 1 call, responding to a burglary, assault, whatever it is that might be in progress, that's a lights and sirens call. We were not supposed to exceed the posted speed limit by more than 10 miles an hour. Now, yeah, it's pretty easy to go more than 10 miles an hour over when the speed limit in the city is 25 or even 30 miles an hour. You could find yourself up to 50 miles an hour pretty quick as you're trying to get to that call. But it ties right into what you're saying about training. I'm a firm believer in first line supervision. And you had mentioned in your presentation enforcement or accountability. And, you know, a lot of times we've heard some of our guys on our side training and emphasizing that peer-to-peer pressure needs to also work in this. Older officers, and you mentioned, and I think, you know, when you and I first talked about what it was that could be leading to this increase, my answer was distractions and younger officers. But you also picked up on a key point, and I was going to mention carjackings, because I know where I live, carjackings here in DC and in the Montgomery County where I live and across the DMV here have skyrocketed. Now they're calming down a little bit, but at one point the carjackings were brazen in broad daylight, and officers were finding themselves behind freshly carjacked cars, which is going to be a pursuit. They're armed. They've taken a vehicle by force. That's going to be, so that is another reason that and you mentioned stolen autos, but that's another reason why I know we've seen an increase in pursuits across the nation. I'm also aware, though, and I'm sure you are, agencies and municipalities across the country have been actually reducing their restrictions on some pursuits. Now, I can't remember what state it was, but I know there is one state that's done that. And I know here in DC, they've even looked at kind of coming back off of because we had an absolute no pursuit policy, absent, you know, bloody murder and death, that kind of thing. And now they've sort of rolled that back a little bit, and hence we were pursuing more carjacked vehicles.
Yeah, that's correct. I think the state that you're thinking of is New Jersey, who reversed their prior policy that they would not have pursuits for stolen vehicles. And they've recently changed that. I believe it was 2 years ago or 1 year ago. I did reach out to the New Jersey Attorney General's office, who is in charge of this statewide policy in their state. And they said they don't yet have any data they can release about how that policy change has affected the number of pursuits in that state. But we can imagine that most likely when you loosen your pursuit policy, you're going to have more pursuits.
Exactly. We good with questions? No more questions?
Yep.
No? Okay. Somebody did ask a question about the flash drives. And as soon as they're available, I can notify folks. We should have your email from registration. So I'm hoping, well, they got to be ready before IACP. So hopefully that'll be ready as I finish this video shoot tomorrow. We've got to load all that stuff on there and have them mass produced. But they'll certainly be ready by October 17th, which is when IACP starts. And once we get back from IACP, we can mail them out or mention them again during our third quarter or fourth quarter report and make sure everybody gets an updated flash drive. Well, I want to thank Rio, and I want to thank Emilie in particular. What's that? Yep, I got covered that. Sorry. I want to thank Emilie as well for joining us with some really interesting information. You know, this is nothing we should shy away from. This is something we need to look at and embrace. And as you've heard me say before, we can't do anything without data. And, you know, look at the data that Emilie and her colleagues got and are showing up a problem here that we need to address. And the last thing I'll mention, and this is the hill I want to die on, it's training. We train with our firearms twice a year. When I was on my agency, I didn't go to driver's training unless I had an at-fault crash, which I did. And that was it. If you were in a crash and it wasn't your fault, you didn't go back to driver's training, but there was no refresher. I didn't get a refresher until I had over 10 years on. And you do get into some bad habits when you get out there. And if the older veteran officers are showing officers how to click that seatbelt behind them so they don't have to listen to that annoying dinging, that's the kind of stuff we need to stop. And we need to train on something that costs us probably more than the use of our firearms, gets us into more injuries and problems with not just officers, but civilians. It's definitely something that agencies have to look at, and we should be training annually as well. I know that's easier said than done, given the problems we have with retention, the problems we have with recruiting, and the problems we have with then keeping our staffing up. It's very difficult, particularly for these small agencies. And those of you who are LELs out there that have small agencies, hopefully something can be done to where the state and municipal agencies, sheriff's departments can all come together and assist each other in training or even coverage so people can go to training. We've seen that happen in Ohio with Below 100. We're nationwide, put together money so that officers could have overtime to come cover shifts, so these guys in these smaller agencies could get the Below 100 training. So hopefully there'll be more on those resources. But if I have to emphasize anything out of what we do, it's got to be increased training around all the issues we've discussed. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We will, as always, if you have somebody you'd like to hear from or you think offers really good information, let me know. I think we're going to try and hear from Independence, Ohio in our next webinar. We'll see if they're able and willing to come on and tell us about what they did to improve their officer traffic safety. So everyone, email me if you have any questions. I can also forward emails to Emilie if you didn't catch her email, and we'll get right back to you with any questions you might have. So thanks everybody. Have a safe day. Appreciate it.